The Supreme Court just dropped a bombshell that's sending shockwaves through Westminster. While Keir Starmer thought that he could quietly slip Britain back into the EU's grip through a secret deal, the highest court in the land just obliterated his plans. This isn't just another political setback. This is a constitutional earthquake that exposes the most dangerous betrayal of Brexit since the referendum itself. What the judges revealed in their ruling will make your blood boil, because it proves that everything you suspected about Starmer's true intentions was absolutely right. The evidence is damning, the timing is suspicious, and the implications for British sovereignty are catastrophic. Stick around, because what I'm about to reveal will change how you see this government forever. Just 1 minute ago, the Supreme Court delivered a ruling that's completely destroyed Keir Starmer's carefully constructed plan to drag Britain back into the European Union. And let me tell you, this isn't some minor legal technicality or bureaucratic dispute. This is the exposure of a deliberate, calculated betrayal that goes right to the heart of what Brexit was supposed to achieve. The Supreme Court's decision has ripped the mask off Starmer's government and revealed what millions of Brexit voters already knew deep down. This Labour government never accepted the result of the referendum. They never respected the will of the British people. And they've been working behind closed doors to reverse Brexit through the back door while lying to your face about respecting democracy. Here's what actually happened. And the details are absolutely explosive. For months now, whispers have been circulating in Westminster about secret negotiations between Starmer's government and Brussels. These weren't the normal diplomatic channels that governments use. These were clandestine meetings, undisclosed agreements, and shadowy deals being hammered out, avoid from parliamentary scrutiny. The government repeatedly denied these rumours. Ministers stood at the dispatch box and told MPs that Britain's relationship with the EU was settled. They said Brexit was done and there were no plans to rejoin EU structures. But they were lying. And now the Supreme Court has the receipts to prove it. The case that came before the Supreme Court wasn't even supposed to expose this scandal. It started as a legal challenge brought by a group of Brexit-supporting MPs and campaigners who'd obtained documents through Freedom of Information requests. These documents hinted at something deeply troubling. They showed that senior civil servants in the Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office had been in regular contact with EU officials about what they called a new framework for UK-EU cooperation. Sounds innocent enough, right? Wrong. Because when legal experts started digging into what this framework actually meant, they discovered it was nothing less than a blueprint for re-entering EU jurisdiction in multiple areas of British law and policy. The Supreme Court heard evidence that made it crystal clear what Starmer's government was planning. First, there was the proposed alignment on regulatory standards. Now, you might think that just means keeping similar rules to make trade easier. But here's the sinister part. The documents revealed that this alignment would be dynamic, not static. That means Britain wouldn't just adopt similar rules to the EU. It means we would automatically adopt future EU regulations without Parliament having any say. Think about that for a second. Unelected bureaucrats in Brussels would be writing laws that apply in Britain, and your elected representatives in Westminster would be powerless to stop them. That's not cooperation. That's surrender of sovereignty. That's the complete opposite of what 17.4 million people voted for in 2016. But it gets worse. The Supreme Court also examined evidence about plans to rejoin aspects of the European Court of Justice's jurisdiction. This is the red line that even moderate Brexiteers said could never be crossed. The ECJ is the EU's supreme legal authority, and one of the fundamental principles of Brexit was that British courts, not European courts, would have the final say on British law. Yet here's Starmer's government negotiating to give the ECJ power over UK disputes in certain policy areas. The lawyers arguing the case presented email exchanges between UK officials and their EU counterparts where they discussed the terms under which Britain would accept ECJ rulings. In one particularly damning email, a senior Foreign Office official wrote that they needed to find a way to make ECJ jurisdiction palatable to the British public without actually calling it that. They were literally strategizing about how to deceive you. The Supreme Court justices were clearly shocked by what they heard. In their ruling, they used unusually strong language to condemn the government's approach. The lead judge stated that the negotiations appeared to undermine fundamental principles established by the Brexit referendum and subsequent legislation. Another judge noted that the lack of parliamentary oversight raised serious constitutional concerns. These aren't political commentators or partisan activists saying this. These are the most senior judges in Britain, people who've spent decades interpreting constitutional law, and they're essentially saying that Starmer's government was operating outside the bounds of proper democratic accountability. The ruling didn't just strike down aspects of the proposed deal. It questioned whether the government had the legal authority to negotiate such arrangements without explicit parliamentary approval. Now, let's talk about what was actually in this secret deal, because the details are absolutely enraging. According to evidence presented to the court, the framework Starmer was negotiating included Britain rejoining the EU customs union in all but name. There would be a new trade arrangement that eliminated tariffs and quotas, which sounds good until you realise it comes with a massive catch. Britain would have to follow EU trade policy and wouldn't be able to negotiate independent trade deals with other countries. Remember all those promises about global Britain, about striking trade agreements with Australia, Japan and potentially America? All of that would be dead. We'd be back to being a rule taker from Brussels. Except this time we wouldn't even have MEPs or a seat at the table when those rules are decided. The deal also included provisions on freedom of movement that were deliberately obscured with technical language. Instead of calling it freedom of movement, the documents referred to enhanced mobility frameworks and reciprocal migration arrangements. But when legal experts translated the jargon, it became clear this was freedom of movement by another name. EU citizens would have the right to live and work in Britain with minimal restrictions, while British immigration policy would once again be controlled by EU regulations. This is exactly what voters rejected. People voted for Brexit largely because they wanted control over borders and immigration policy returned to Westminster, and here's Starmer trying to give it back to Brussels, while pretending he's not. The Supreme Court's ruling didn't just expose what was in the deal, it revealed the shocking extent of the deception involved in how this was being negotiated. Throughout the entire process, Starmer's government maintained a carefully crafted public position that was completely at odds with what they were actually doing behind closed doors. When pressed in Parliament about Britain's relationship with the EU, ministers would give carefully worded answers that were technically true but fundamentally misleading. They'd say things like, "We have no plans to rejoin the European Union," which sounds reassuring until you realise they were negotiating arrangements that would bind Britain to EU rules without formally rejoining. It's the kind of semantic game playing that makes people lose faith in democracy entirely. What makes this betrayal even more insulting is the timing. Starmer waited until he had a massive parliamentary majority before pushing ahead with these secret negotiations. He knew that with Labour's dominance in the Commons, there would be limited ability for opposition MPs to scrutinise what his government was doing. He calculated that he could present the British public with a fait accompli. By the time people realised what was happening, the deal would already be signed and implemented. The Supreme Court's intervention has blown that strategy apart, but it reveals just how little respect this government has for democratic accountability. They weren't planning to seek your permission. They weren't going to have a proper debate. They were going to impose this on the country and hope you wouldn't notice until it was too late. The evidence presented to the Supreme Court also revealed the EU's role in all of this. And it's absolutely crucial to understand their perspective. Brussels never accepted Brexit. They saw it as a catastrophic loss that undermined the entire European project. From the moment Britain voted to leave, EU officials have been working on strategies to bring the UK back into the fold. They've been explicit about this in their internal communications. Documents leaked to the court showed EU negotiators discussing how a Labour government under Starmer represented their best opportunity to reverse Brexit without the political cost of Britain formally rejoining. They could get most of what they wanted through these regulatory alignments and legal frameworks without having to go through the politically difficult process of UK accession to the EU. Think about what that means. The EU has been actively working with Starmer's government to undermine British sovereignty. They've been collaborating to find ways around the democratic decision made by the British people, and they've been doing it with the full cooperation of our own Prime Minister. This isn't conspiracy theory, this isn't speculation, this is documented fact that's now part of the official court record. The Supreme Court heard testimony from former EU officials who admitted that the entire strategy was designed to create what they called functional integration without formal membership. Britain would be integrated into EU structures in practice while maintaining the fiction of independence. It's the ultimate have your cake and eat it scenario, except in this version, the EU gets everything it wants while Britain loses all the benefits we voted for. The financial implications of Starmer's secret deal are another bombshell that the Supreme Court ruling has exposed. One of the key Brexit victories was ending Britain's massive annual payments to the EU budget. We were sending billions of pounds every year to Brussels, money that could be spent on the NHS, schools or infrastructure here at home. The Supreme Court heard evidence that Starmer's framework included substantial financial contributions to EU programmes and budgets. The government tried to disguise these as partnership fees or cooperation costs, but the reality is clear. Britain would be paying billions to the EU again. And for what? For the privilege of following their rules without having any say in making them. It's taxation without representation on a continental scale. During the court proceedings, government lawyers tried to argue that these arrangements were necessary for Britain's economic prosperity. They presented a forecast suggesting that closer alignment with the EU would boost trade and investment. But here's what they didn't mention. Those same economic models existed before Brexit, and they were all proven wrong. Remember how we were told that voting for Brexit would cause an immediate recession, that unemployment would skyrocket, that investment would collapse? None of it happened. Britain's economy has been resilient. We've maintained strong trade relationships, and we've gained the flexibility to respond to challenges like the pandemic in ways that EU membership would have prevented. The economic scare tactics didn't work in 2016, and they shouldn't work now. The Supreme Court also examined evidence about how this secret deal would affect specific industries and sectors. Take fishing, for example. One of the most symbolic issues during the Brexit campaign was taking back control of British waters. Fishing communities that had been devastated by the EU's common fisheries policy were promised that Brexit would restore their rights and livelihoods. The documents revealed in court showed that Starmer's deal would grant EU fishing fleets continued access to UK waters under terms that were barely different from what existed before Brexit. British fishermen would be sold out again. Their industry would remain under EU control. All those promises made to coastal communities would be broken, and this pattern repeated across multiple sectors. Farmers would face EU agricultural regulations. Financial services would be subject to EU oversight. Even areas like data protection and digital policy would fall under Brussels authority. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Supreme Court's findings was the evidence of how deeply embedded pro-EU sentiment is within the British civil service. The case revealed that many senior officials never accepted the Brexit vote and have been actively working to undermine it from within. Email exchanges between Mandarins showed them discussing Brexit as a problem to be managed rather than a democratic instruction to be implemented. They talked about finding creative interpretations of ministerial directions that would preserve EU alignment. They coordinated with EU officials to identify loopholes and workarounds in Brexit legislation. This is the deep state that people talk about, and the Supreme Court has just provided documented proof that it's real and it's working against the will of the British people. The ruling has sent panic through Starmer's government because it doesn't just block this specific deal. It establishes legal precedents that will make it much harder for any government to surrender sovereignty without explicit parliamentary approval. The judges made it clear that the Brexit referendum and subsequent legislation created constitutional principles that can't be casually set aside. Any attempt to rejoin the EU structures or submit to EU jurisdiction must go through proper democratic processes, including full parliamentary debate and potentially even another referendum. This is a massive victory for democracy and accountability. It means Starmer can't just impose his pro-EU agenda through executive action. He'd have to face Parliament and ultimately face the British people. The political fallout from this Supreme Court ruling is going to be absolutely massive, and we're already seeing the panic spreading through Westminster. Starmer's entire political strategy has been built on projecting competence and stability after the chaos of the previous government. He's positioned himself as the serious, trustworthy leader who respects institutions and follows the rules. But this Supreme Court judgment has completely shattered that image. It's exposed him as someone willing to operate in secret, to deceive Parliament and to betray the democratic mandate of the Brexit referendum. The damage to his credibility is potentially terminal. How can anyone trust a Prime Minister who's been caught red-handed trying to reverse the biggest democratic decision in British history without telling anyone what he was doing? Conservative MPs are already calling for Starmer's resignation, and it's not just the usual suspects making noise. Even some moderate Tories who've tried to work constructively with the Labour government are expressing genuine outrage at what's been revealed. Former cabinet ministers who negotiated the original Brexit deal are particularly furious because they can see how their work is being systematically dismantled. One former minister told reporters that this ruling proves what many suspected all along, that Starmer never had any intention of respecting Brexit and has been planning to reverse it from the moment he entered number 10. The calls for a vote of no confidence are growing louder by the hour, and while Labour's massive majority means Starmer probably survives any parliamentary challenge, the political damage is done. His authority has been fundamentally undermined. But here's what really matters. This isn't just about one Prime Minister or one government. This Supreme Court ruling represents a critical moment in the ongoing battle for British sovereignty and democracy. Ever since the Brexit vote in 2016, there's been a constant effort by the political establishment to water down, delay or reverse what the people decided. We saw it with the attempts to block Article 50. We saw it with the endless parliamentary games to force a softer Brexit. We saw it with the betrayal of Theresa May's withdrawal agreement. And now we're seeing it with Starmer's secret EU deal. The pattern is unmistakable. A significant portion of Britain's political class simply refuses to accept that the country voted to leave the European Union, and they'll use any means necessary to drag us back in. The Supreme Court has just thrown a massive roadblock in their path, but don't think for a second that this fight is over. The pro-EU forces in British politics are deeply entrenched and incredibly well funded. They have support from major corporations, international organisations and foreign governments who all want to see Brexit reversed. They control much of the media, they dominate academia, and they have sympathetic allies throughout the civil service. This ruling is a setback for them, but they're not going to give up. They'll regroup, they'll find new strategies, and they'll keep pushing to bring Britain back under EU control. The only thing standing in their way is an informed and vigilant British public that refuses to let democracy be stolen. What can you do about this? First, share this information as widely as possible. The mainstream media is already trying to downplay the significance of this Supreme Court ruling. They're framing it as a minor legal dispute rather than the exposure of a fundamental betrayal. Don't let them get away with that. Make sure everyone you know understands what Starmer was trying to do and how close he came to succeeding. Second, contact your MP and demand answers, whether they're Labour, Conservative or any other party. They need to know that their constituents are watching and that there will be political consequences for anyone who supports attempts to undermine Brexit. Third, stay informed and stay engaged. Democracy isn't something you can vote for once and then forget about. It requires constant attention and active participation to protect it from those who would undermine it. The economic arguments for Starmer's secret deal don't hold up under scrutiny, and it's important to understand why. The pro-EU lobby constantly claims that Britain needs closer alignment with Brussels for economic prosperity. But the evidence tells a completely different story. Since leaving the EU, Britain has signed trade deals with countries representing billions of people and trillions in GDP. We've joined the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, giving us preferential access to some of the world's fastest growing economies. We've negotiated deals with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and many others. These are opportunities that simply weren't available as an EU member because Brussels controlled our trade policy. Starmer's deal would have destroyed all of that progress and locked us back into an EU-centric trading model that's increasingly outdated in a globalised world. The Supreme Court ruling also has implications far beyond Brexit. It's a statement about constitutional limits on executive power and the importance of parliamentary sovereignty. The judges essentially told the government that there are some decisions too fundamental to be made behind closed doors. When you're talking about surrendering national sovereignty, submitting to foreign jurisdiction, or reversing major democratic mandates, you can't just do that through secret negotiations and executive agreements. You need explicit parliamentary authorisation, full public debate, and democratic accountability. This principle applies to more than just EU relations. It's a check on any government that might try to bypass democratic processes to implement unpopular policies. It's a victory for everyone who believes in transparent, accountable government. Looking at the specific legal reasoning in the Supreme Court's decision reveals just how damning their assessment of Starmer's actions really was. The judges pointed out that the Brexit legislation didn't just take Britain out of the EU, it established new constitutional principles about sovereignty and democratic control. When Parliament passed the European Union Withdrawal Act, it wasn't just repealing old laws, it was making a fundamental statement about how Britain would be governed going forward. The Act explicitly transferred powers from EU institutions back to UK institutions and established that British law would be supreme in British territory. Starmer's secret deal violated these principles by attempting to transfer powers back to the EU without going through the proper legislative process. The judges made it clear that you can't use executive agreements to undo what Parliament has legislated without Parliament's explicit consent. The international reaction to this Supreme Court ruling has been fascinating and revealing. Predictably, EU officials have expressed disappointment and concern. They're upset that their carefully constructed plan to bring Britain back into the fold has been derailed. But their response has been telling. Instead of respecting the court's decision and Britain's democratic processes, they've tried to pressure the UK government to find alternative ways to achieve the same objectives. EU Commission spokespeople have talked about the need for regulatory alignment and continued cooperation, using exactly the same euphemisms that got Starmer into trouble in the first place. It proves that Brussels hasn't learned anything and still doesn't respect British sovereignty. They see Britain as a wayward province that needs to be brought back under control, not as an independent nation with the right to chart its own course. Meanwhile, countries outside the EU have welcomed the Supreme Court's decision because they understand what it means for Britain's ability to be a genuine global partner. Trade negotiators from the United States, India, and other major economies have been watching closely to see whether Britain was serious about its post-Brexit independence or whether it would drift back into the EU's orbit. This ruling sends a clear signal that Britain intends to maintain its sovereignty and pursue an independent trade policy. That makes the UK a more attractive partner for countries that want bilateral relationships rather than having to negotiate with the entire EU bloc. It opens up opportunities that Starmer's secret deal would have permanently closed off. The economic benefits of genuine independence far outweigh the alleged advantages of EU alignment that pro-Remain campaigners keep promoting. The Supreme Court ruling also exposes the fundamental dishonesty of Starmer's political brand. Throughout his career, he's presented himself as a man of principle, a former human rights lawyer who respects the rule of law and democratic norms. But this scandal reveals someone willing to circumvent democratic processes, operate in secret, and deceive the public about his true intentions. The contrast between his public statements and his private actions couldn't be starker. While telling voters he respected the Brexit decision, he was actively working to reverse it. While promising transparency and accountability, he was conducting clandestine negotiations with foreign powers. While claiming to put country before party, he was pursuing an ideological agenda that the majority of British people explicitly rejected. This isn't just a policy disagreement. This is a question of character, integrity and fitness for office. And the Supreme Court has just provided definitive evidence that Keir Starmer fails on all counts. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double check responses.